Every once in a while I get contacted by a customer or a fan asking if I can replicate or rebuild one of their models. Now normally I say no to this, especially for the 1/24th scale builds, as they simply take up too much time and I have way too much on my hands as it is already. But with these 1/43rd scale die-cast builds, I find them really fun to do, and they don't really take all that long, so it is a nice quick project in between the bigger ones, just to put my mind onto something else. This time around I was contacted in order to repaint and rebuild a Rolls-Royce Phantom. This is one of my favorite cars, and I have one in my own collection as well, so I will be rebuilding another one in the future, but then in my own colors. But in this case, the customer wanted it to be repainted in a silver with a two-tone on the lower half of the body, basically just the side skirts, front bumper, and a part of the rear bumper as well, as you can see on this one, but then with the main body being silver and those lower areas being a super light gray, just to have a nice little bit of contrast to it, and also have the entire interior repainted in a black with some wood accent pieces on the trim parts. So as usual with these rebuilds, the process is pretty much the same. I first need to disassemble the entire model and remove all of the plastic parts and pieces all around and save what I can save for the rebuild before, of course, stripping the paint off the metal and starting the cleanup and repaint process. With a lot of these die-cast models, the actual windows themselves and some other interior parts are riveted into the body itself, so those need to be drilled out in order to carefully remove them. Now once all of the parts have been removed, I can dunk the body into some paint stripper. I'm using a paint stripper from Rust-Oleum, but you can pretty much find something local. Also, a lot of paint strippers are called aircraft remover, so that's a good thing to keep in note once you are looking for some of these strippers to do these kinds of jobs. Something to keep in mind when stripping the paint: the decals or other small details that are applied onto the actual body color will of course also be removed and completely damaged, and 9 out of 10 times they are not usable anymore. Now in this case there were some metal stickers underneath the decals themselves, so I could carefully cut a couple of the logos off, attach them to a piece of tape to later on be glued back onto the body. The Rust-Oleum paint stripper that I'm using here is pretty strong, but not as strong as the good old stuff used to be, but we have to be a little bit more environmentally friendly, so it's not as harsh anymore. So it took a couple of dunks into the paint stripper before it was all removed, and also a little bit of cleaning in between, and some scribing afterwards to remove it from the panel lines themselves. On the main body itself, there were a couple of mold lines and some imperfections from the actual build itself in the factory that needs to be sanded out, smoothed out, and just cleaned up in general. I could then sand the entire body down with a 400 grit sanding pad from Tamiya just to make it nice and rough for the primer to stick to it. I applied some primer on the inside just to protect the bare metal there, and also of course a couple nice coats on the exterior. First couple coats of primer have been applied and they cured really nicely, but there were still a couple of rougher scratches that could be seen through the primer, so I quickly just sanded those down with a 600 grit before applying another coat of primer, which will then fully cover up all of those scratches and leave a nice smooth finish before I started applying the paint. So during the clear coating stage, in the final coat of clear, there were a couple of spots of dust that landed in there and were pretty much stuck. I tried getting them out with some tweezers and also with a sharp knife, just lifting it up and out of there, but that didn't really work out all that well. I left a couple of scratches in the paint itself and it didn't really look good, so I basically had to start over. I first tried sanding it out, smoothing it out, and applying another coat of silver to then clear coat it later on and move on, but that didn't really look good. There were still a couple of dimples in the paint that were highly visible, so I decided just to start all over again. With the restart now completed, we can move on onto the color stage. The primer has cured and I can start applying the color on those lower areas, or specifically the side skirts, the rear skirt underneath the bumper, and of course also on the front bumper as well. I applied a couple light coats of steel from Splash Paints, let that cure overnight, and then carefully started masking it all off. With all of those steel parts now masked, I can move on to the main body color, which is going to be aluminum. This is also a color from Splash. Since the silver paint is a really light silver and it matches pretty closely with the primer color, it's not really showing up all that well on camera, so I'm not going to show the entire process of applying 2 to 3 coats of this paint before I got full coverage. Instead, I'm just going to stick it with one layer right here and then skip to the unmasking stage and move on to the clear coat. So as you can see right here, the steel is a pretty close match to the actual silver that I used for the body, but there is a nice little contrast, giving it a super subtle look on the lower areas, making that look a bit more shaded and a bit more dark, just making it stick out enough for it to be a nice visual effect. And as usual, after all of the unmasking has been done, I mixed up some clear again from Splash and started applying it lightly on those areas that are hard to reach and easy to forget first, of course, and then moving on to the rest of the body, applying 3 coats in total, making it nice, smooth, and glossy, and keeping the coats pretty thin as I don't really want to build up a thick layer and fill up all of the panel lines. The final coat of clear has now been applied. I'm really happy with the way that it looks, nice and smooth. I could then set that aside for a couple of days to cure, and in the meantime move on to the interior. Now personally, I really like the way that this interior looks and love this color, though the customer wanted to be black and also have a contrasting wood trim for the interior pieces. So the main interior was disassembled from the exterior earlier on, but now I just need to disassemble all of the interior parts in order to remove a couple of the decals and also to make it a lot easier for it to be repainted. Sometimes it requires a bit of patience for the entire interior to be taken apart, and also a couple of parts that need to be cut off or simply just pulled off. Once you've figured that all out, move on to the rest of the interior, and of course once that is completed you can move on to the primer stage. Now since all of these interior parts are already painted, you could simply decide to just paint over it and move on. I personally always like to apply a coat of Tamiya primer to act as a base layer between the colors that are already on there and the new colors that are going to be applied on top of it, just with a bit of a barrier in between so they don't react with one another. And I always like the base coat of the primer as a nice base that is even all over with the same color so that we don't have any differences between colors being applied on top of different colors. Now with it being painted black, that usually shouldn't be a problem as black pretty much covers it all, but then again I still like the neutral base of primer to be in between. So the parts are now all repainted in black, and I can start adding the details, specifically the wood trim. On a couple of the pieces for the center console, the door cards, and also the dashboard is where these smaller trim pieces are. So I start applying a nice light coat of a sand or light brown. Then once that is cured, I'm going to go over top of it with a different shade of brown, a bit more of a flesh tone. In this case it is called mud brown, to cover that all up lightly, just showing through really shallow colors from the layer underneath. And then once that is applied, again I just let it cure and finally go on top of it with a darker gray, just to pop in with a wood grain, really lightly brushing over it, barely applying any paint, and making the streaks very visible to act as the wood grain finish. And then once that is all completed, I finally finish it all off and make the wood come to life with a coat of clear orange. If you want to know more about this specific technique, I have done a separate how-to video on the channel. That is how to paint wood grain. After applying that clear orange, I set the parts overnight to cure, and then the next day I could move on to adding all of the details back onto the dashboard, center console, and various other pieces to bring it back to life. With the gauges now painted white, that is pretty much the final detail that needs to be added, and I could start the assembly. All of this is going to be glued back together with some CA glue that is called Super Gold Plus from Bob Smith Industries. One small detail that I did forget was adding the red to the seatbelt buckles, so I quickly applied that with a small toothpick. The interior is finished off and the exterior has had a couple of days to cure for the clear coat, so that is nice and dry, and I can move on to adding additional details here as well to finish it up. On the hood there is a nice strip of chrome, so I applied a small strip of mirror foil from Hasegawa, and also did the same for the window trim around the sides. As far as exterior details go, that is pretty much it. So all of the glass could carefully be glued back in one by one, and I could start the reassembly of all the exterior parts as well. All of the clear parts are pre-painted and have some nice detail, but it wasn't done to the highest standard, so I did need to apply a couple of touch-ups in order to not have it show any light through and just clean it up in general. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, some of the logos were able to be cut off carefully as they had a metal plate behind it. I just saved them on a piece of masking tape, peeled them off carefully, and could glue them back in place with a little bit of super glue. Now, usually if these decals do not survive, you can probably buy some decals online, but it is really hard to find, or have some custom printed, but that will probably get really expensive. So in this case, you would lose the small logos on the sides for Rolls-Royce, and these indicators would need to be painted on by hand. The mirrors are back in place. I still needed to add a small detail on the side for the lock and also paint the taillights clear red. Somehow the manufacturer of this model did not paint them from factory, and it looked kind of weird, so I gave them a couple coats of Tamiya clear red to finish this one off. And with that said, this one is finished and off to the customer. I hope you guys enjoy these small little rebuild videos. I really enjoy them myself and love to see happy customers with these small projects that are quick and fun to do. With that said and done, it is back to the usual schedule and pick up some of the other builds that I still have laying around unfinished.